my other favorites is the Satanic Panic, where tons and tons of parents in the 80s were afraid that their daycares were stealing their kids and performing satanic rituals on them. I think, that's when Dungeons and Dragons really was getting the ire of people.
And metal music, right?
Oh God, metal music. Just found a old video that I posted on my Instagram that was for parents, and it was basically how to tell if your child is worshiping Satan. And it's like, are they listening to heavy metal music? Are they rude to you? Do you see sacrificial, implements, a robe, a cup, and all this stuff? And it was just so ridiculous.
Welcome to Speculative Sandbox, your audio playground for creative storytellers. My name is Vicky Lawn, and each episode, I and a guest will unpack a fiction trope with an eye for character development and narrative structures. Make sure to look for Speculative Sandbox on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, where you can join the conversation. Leave comments or questions, or let us know what other tropes we should cover. When the real world just doesn't cut it, let's get lost in a fictional one.
This episode is brought to you by Stars. Lisa Tadeo's best-selling book is about to become your favorite new show. Based on a true story, the new Stars original series 3 Women stars Shailene Woodley as Gia, a grieving and struggling writer who embarks on a cross-country road trip where she meets 3 women determined to radically change their lives. This one is not to be missed. Watch the season premiere of 3 Women now, only on Stars and the Stars app.
Have you ever wondered what it's like to bite into Nerds gummy clusters? They're fruity. They're tangy. They're gummy. And they're crunchy. Nerds Gummy Clusters, a union of fruity sweet gummy and tangy crunchy nerds. Unleash your senses. Shop now at nerdscandy.com.
Ian Young, I am so excited to have you back on the podcast with me today. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. We had to continue our conversation because last time you were with me, we talked specifically about madness from the individual perspective with mental health. But today we're going to be talking about mass hysteria. So we're taking it from the individual to the larger scale. So before we get started, you want to introduce yourself real quick and then we'll go into the icebreaker.
Sure. My name is Ian Young. I'm an author. I have one book out right now, The Automaton, and other than that, that's me.
All right, let's get started with the icebreaker questions.
Sure.
What is one favorite thing you've done so far this summer?
I actually just got back from a trip up north. Then we go with the family. We go up to Lake Superior, which
Nice.
is like our ocean.
Okay.
Up here. So it's, it was 60 degrees. It was cool and picturesque, and it's very relaxing.
How hot is it right now where you usually are?
Well, I'm in the Twin Cities and it's about 80s right now.
Oh, that's
So
nice.
it's a pretty big jump.
I am currently sweating it out at 108.
Oh, that's gross.
But it's a dry heat, everyone tells me.
That
But
doesn't...
I mean, I've been to Texas though in the summer and that was miserable. So that one's really humid and hot and worse. I couldn't even breathe.
We have a lot of humidity, but the one time I went to Arizona, I don't remember how long we were even out in the weather, and my brother's nose started bleeding and his lips are cracking. And I'm like,
yeah.
oh, anytime someone says it's a dry heat, I'm like, no,
it's brutal.
It's
yeah, it's
hot.
a little brutal. I almost feel like I'm going to wrinkle way faster because I just can't keep moisture in my skin. It's so dry.
Yeah.
Okay, if you could open up your own bookstore at no cost, what would be your unique selling point? What's your gimmick?
I think it would be, I would try to have as many independent books or, still have some classics, but I really would love to bring out independent books and independent authors.
Okay.
Into the mainstream.
That's awesome. I love that. All right. Now the next question segues into our topic, which is, have you ever witnessed mass hysteria?
Well, That's interesting. I think I think I'm gonna say yeah, but it's gonna be in like the little kids who, when one sees another, they start screaming, which causes everybody else to start screaming, and the next thing you know, there's 20 kids running around like their hair's on fire.
That's a really good description, because I feel like that does walk you through the process of some of these mass hysteria cases that we're probably going to
Yeah,
walk through.
right.
So yeah, let's talk about mass hysteria and cover the definition. I found two definitions. I'm going to read them. Let me know what you think, and we'll kind of go from
Sure.
there. So the first definition is apparently a contagious dissociative phenomena that takes place in large groups of people or institutions under conditions of anxiety. That's the first one.
Mm-hmm.
And the second definition is a phenomenon that transmits collective illusions of threats, whether real or imaginary, through a population and society as a result of rumors and fear. What do you think of those definitions?
They're very, very broad, for
Mm-hmm.
sure. You know, when I was looking this up too, there's so many different names too. You know, there's mass hysteria, mass panic, mass psychogenic disorders, or this sort of thing. Um, it is a very broad topic because there are the physical symptoms and physical manifestations that are connected with it, and then there are the emotional, sort of the panic driven side of it.
Yeah, it does seem like I was seeing cases where illness would break out in a school, and I'm like, well, to me, when I think of mass hysteria, specifically using the term hysteria, I think about how hysteria is used to diagnose something that is otherwise kind of unknown, like kind of when women were diagnosed with hysteria for basically having feelings in the old days. And so for
Which,
me, when I think of his mass hysteria, I don't think we could tie it directly to like a flu outbreak. I think it's more psychological, but what are your thoughts?
well, it's interesting that you mentioned the women part, because the word hysteria comes from hyster, which is like the Latin or Greek root word for uterus.
Mm.
So it's always been, so like hysteria. If you look up hysteria, you know, it's like kind of what we just described, this madness, this overly emotional type behavior or thoughts, usually anxiety driven, stress driven. But because in the beginning it was all thought to be predominantly women that would go through this, that's where that term hysteria comes from, which isn't terribly accurate now. So I think by they I mean that, the people that are researching all this stuff, they like to have the mass psychogenic whatchamacallit, or the mass panic, or that sort of thing, just because
Gotcha.
hysteria is a little outdated.
That's a really good note. Okay, so then what are some examples of what should we call it? Just mass panic, mass hysteria, mass
I mean, I think,
confusion?
yeah, because when we as a population think of mass hysteria, we all sort of have the idea of what we're talking about, and it may not be, you know, definition specific, but I think we all understand what it means. If you're cool saying mass hysteria, I am.
I was
We
going to
just
use
know
that
that
for the
it's not.
title just because it's
Yeah,
I can't, we got to go into the clickbaity stuff.
that's right. Parenthesis, not just the women.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Do you want to talk about fiction examples or real life examples first?
I think real life's going to be juicier. So let's go with fiction first.
I agree, because when I was looking up fiction, first of all, I was finding a lot of nonfiction books teaching
Yeah.
about mass hysteria, and then I tried to go into fiction, and a lot of it was like pre-apocalyptic breakdown of society, the fifth wave. This book is full of spiders by Jason Pargin, that kind of stuff. But to me,
Mhm.
I'm like, how are we classifying this as there's a clear cause that then causes the reaction, or is there a reaction that we then have to go in and determine the cause?
Well,
Like a zombie outbreak, that's obvious, right? A zombie outbreak is causing mass panic.
I think we can look at it both ways. I did the same thing. I looked up movies because I figured that would be an interesting look at it. And
Mm-hmm.
um, the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence, Don't Look Up, was like one of
Oh,
the
yeah.
first on a bunch of these lists. And I was thinking about it. I'm like, well, you would think that's more like a mass panic, in the sense of there is a real reason why you should panic. and then everybody does. But then the trick there is people reacting in sort of abnormal ways, right? So there's a legitimate threat, but people are like, during COVID, people are hoarding toilet paper because people are dying left and right, but God help us if we have, a dirty butt. Sorry, you can cut that out. That's gross. You know what I mean? Like we need, like, oh my gosh, how am I going to clean myself? How am I going to wipe? Get all the toilet paper we can. So that's more like the panic. But with the hysteria in fiction, we can look at stories that are based off of real things that happen. So, for instance, one of the biggest events in America would be Salem witch trials. So it's this mass hysteria of all these women. There's women again are witches because they're they live alone and they looked at me weird this one time, so they must be a witch, and then we're just going to kill that person. So that is sort of an example of there is a real panic in the sense of maybe your crops aren't doing well or your children are dying from a disease, but then the inappropriate response is, well, it's got to be witches.
Yeah, that'll solve all of our problems. I'm glad you brought up this case because, of course, it was one of the top ones that I found as well. And what this is what they attribute it to. So it says the episode in one of America's most notorious cases of mass hysteria, and it has been used in political rhetoric and popular literature as a cautionary tale about the dangers of specifically isolationism, religious extremism, false accusation, and lapses in due process. Which I thought was really cool.
That's a big one.
I mean, cool in a bad way, but like cool as like an educational way.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So when you look at fiction, then you have like The Crucible, which is a play. I think Stephen King did a bunch of, trying to think if like The Stand would be one, or maybe Tommy Knockers. I'm not quite sure. I'm not as well read with Stephen King as I'd like to be. But I think, there's that distinction with, because there's been other movies that have like the meteor threat, like Deep Impact or Armageddon, right? And then there's the panic. But when you look at witch trial stuff, there isn't the clear threat as panic inducing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the threat is the authority, which could lend itself to a story that has a little bit more mystery to it.
Right.
Because sometimes it's scary to go up against the very authority that's doing the witchcraft if you're living in that society at the time. And I can see how people get swept up into the fear, because now you're worried about a number of things. You're worried about, well, number one, is witchcraft real? And do I want to be a victim of that? But number two, do I want to be accused of witchcraft? And so everyone gets kind of scared into conformity.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, that's true in so many cases. If you look at the Spanish Inquisition, anytime authority is in power that is able to sort of come up with this idea of, here is why due process needs to end. Here is why your freedoms don't matter anymore because XYZ is more important. That's going to definitely be dangerous.
Absolutely. And I think what's fun about fiction, taking real world ideas and not necessarily like recreating them, but being inspired by them in fiction, is that you have a chance to unpack all of those things. And depending on, the genre or the angle that you're taking, I always like the mystery, especially if we're talking about like mass hysteria, where like you're not quite sure why everyone's acting the way that they are. And then you slowly, through the unveiling of the plot, kind of uncover maybe systemic issues or, supernatural or sci-fi issues. That's one way that you can explore this. Or if it's a much more blatantly obvious thing, that's when I think of like zombie movies, right? Where, there's a zombie invasion, why everyone is being like paranoid and panicked and hysterical.
Exactly.
I don't have any other fiction examples. It seems like you have good ones. Do you have any more before we move on to more real life ones?
It's frustrating actually, because I spent a lot of time just staring at my bookshelf and thinking like, oh my God, are there any books that nowadays, and I tons of research, I'm trying to like, there's got to be a book that we all know that sort of has this tone to it. Now, I just read a book, and I'm going to put it in quotes. That's nonfiction, called Communion by Whitley Strieber. Have you ever heard of that?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so it is actually not quite a memoir, but it is a book that this man wrote, because he believes there have been several times when he has been abducted by extraterrestrials. Now, to his point, he doesn't actually say extraterrestrials, he just calls them visitors, but he has these experiences and wrote this book about said experiences. And the interesting thing about alien abduction stories is that there are a lot of people that claim they have common things that happen to them with other people. That, this person from this side of the country and this person from the other side of the country have never met, but when they tell their stories, they're very similar. And he talks about that in his book a few times, where he's talked with other people and they've also said they've seen this and they've seen that. And he tries to make it very clear that these are things that these people didn't know about to begin with. Right. So for someone like me, it's one of my guilty pleasures. Right. I don't know if I believe that extraterrestrials exist, but definitely them breaking into your house and stealing you is a terrifying thing. And it's like my little guilty pleasure as far as reading horror, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So if I come and say, oh yeah, XYZ happened to me, it's like, well, yeah, it makes sense. That's all you do is read about it. But when you find people that have never heard of it as a trope or whatever you want to call it, that's the interesting thing, when they have these separate and certain events, shall we say, in common.
That makes me think of my daughters right now. So my youngest, I have to, this is a process we're working on. She really likes watching YouTube. And there's some things that are great for kids. And of course, there are things that you can easily start spiraling into. It seems like there's a lot of scary stuff for kids, like
Yep.
kids, teens. And I get that. Like, I like scary things when I was younger, but things that they think is like, oh, this is great. This is fine. I'm fine, mom. And then nighttime rolls around. And suddenly I'm up with them for an hour trying to talk to them about the religious, like how your brain is like, all the science fiction, not the science fiction, the science behind your brain and why your brain is hyper aware, and like the dark
Yep.
and like biological histories and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like thinking, like, there's so many kids that experience this, right? They don't talk to each other. They don't scare each other. Sometimes they do. But even when my kids are just doing their own thing, like that kind of united or similarity is that when you consume media that has an influence on you, you end up feeling really panicked and freaked out later. And when you're young, you
Exactly.
might not recognize the connection until like you're older. Then you're like, oh yeah, maybe if I stop watching horror movies, I won't be so scared at night.
Right. Who knows if a child would ever be scared of what's under their bed had they not been told at least once that there's a monster under there, be it by a classmate or by TV,
Mm-hmm.
or the closet or that sort of thing.
Yeah. And it's so sad because when you were once a kid and you had that same fear and now you're trying to teach your kid.
Yeah, I've had to have those talks with both my kids, and I'm like, yeah, there's this really weird, it's almost reflective, where you're like, I know I was scared of this stuff as a kid, but now I'm like, no, there's no way a monster could be under your bed. That's just not how it works.
Well, my main argument is, if that monster really wanted you, wouldn't they have gotten you by now? How many times have you slept? Weren't you once a baby? Wouldn't that have been ideal? We have a tiny dog running around the house. That dog is defenseless against whatever monster you're scared. Don't you think the dog would have been gone by now? Like, I start going through all of these. Like, if you were trying to stalk a child and the child suddenly turned on their phone, oh no, can't stalk them anymore because the light's on.
Or I remember one when I was a kid was, you can't have your foot hanging off the side of the bed
Oh yeah.
because it's the blanket itself that protects you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You have a much darker explanation for that than I would, which is I'm like, well, no, mom and dad are here and we protect you and we make sure stuff like that doesn't happen. And you're
That
like,
was phase
if they're
one.
gonna get you, they're gonna get you.
Yeah.
What can I do about it? They'll get you.
No, I tell him to punch it in the face. Like we have a whole conversation. And then she's like, but what if I hit my sister? I'm like, okay, bring in the sister. I'm like, sister, I've told your little sister that if she's scared of something, she could punch her in the face. So don't sneak up on her. Okay. She's like, okay.
Beautiful.
All right. But
Love
this is
it.
a good segue into real world because we just talked a little bit about the influences of social media and at the rate which things can kind of go around the world now and create its own panic. So one example of this, and I'll go back and talk about some more historical events, but
Sure.
one more example one is when Tourette's syndrome apparently went quote unquote viral per the media. So what's happening is there's this teenage girl and she has Tourette's and she is educating people on what Tourette's syndrome actually looks like. And then suddenly around that time, it was like 2020, 2021, a bunch of girls started going to the doctor and getting diagnosed with Tourette's syndrome. And when they would compare how they were presenting versus this girl that they were following, there was a lot of similarities. And so they were talking about like psychological influences through the screen. Now, I'm not a doctor and I'm not that knowledgeable on Tourette's, so I'm not sure how that works. But I thought that was a really interesting way of like that compares to some of the older ones. For example, I grabbed the story of a nun who lived in a German convent in the 15th century. She began to bite her companions. And soon after that behavior spread through other convents in Germany, Holland, and Italy. So a lot of these things were kind of explained, well, when you observe and you're influenced by it, you find yourself being like persuaded or I don't know what the right word is, influenced, I guess. Again, not a medical doctor, but that's one of the similarities that I saw.
I read that one too, and I love that. I love that story. Just biting people. I don't know.
They ever found out why, right? They just assumed they
Yeah, I mean, so to jump a little bit about these cases, it's really hard to pinpoint what causes them and what's going on because a lot of these are isolated cases. These are smaller populations, and the period of time is not permanent. It's this little snapshot in time. So being able to figure out what's going on with all these people, it's really, really hard. And from what I've been able to glean, the biggest explanation is stress. So there's something that's stressing that now something like biting or the other one of the dancing plague of 1518, where people just start dancing and they can't stop. That's a really interesting way to exhibit your stress. But back to what you were saying, as far as this Tourette's goes, the thing that popped into my mind is, how do you feel when I say the word lice? Like when you start talking about lice and like people's heads start itching, right?
Yeah.
It's like the first thing you think of, or if someone's talking about chicken pox, suddenly you're itching.
Or yawning.
Right, or yawning.
You cause people to yawn just by talking about it.
Right. So it's like there are certain things that, again, I'm not a psychologist, but you can kind of look at and like, yeah, when I say lice, my head starts itching and I get all icky. Like that's a really interesting way of things to spread. But things like, it's almost like the WebMD thing, right? Everything's cancer. Because if you start reading something and you're like, oh yeah, wait, that fits. Wait, that fits too. Oh my God, I've got Tourette's, or oh my gosh, I've got cancer. And it's really, you've got a, splinter or something. I think the brain has a really interesting way of trying to fit how we're feeling into a known frame.
Well, and that time frame of the 2020s on was very stressful for so many people. And I can see how
absolutely
that would play a role, like especially with the time frame when this happened, and especially in regards to Tourette's. Like, who's to say maybe these girls that ended up in like their doctors, or maybe they were genetically predisposed to it and they were exposed to the right conditions for it to show. So it would be unfair to say, oh, just because I saw her do it, now I'm doing it. Maybe there was like more of a genetic connection there. But I mean, who's to say that's the case for all of them? Again, not a doctor, but that actually got me thinking, because I've talked about my neck for like the last time you were on here, and I would research all these things with my neck, and it would range from you pulled your muscle to, you're going to die, you have cancer. And then I finally figured out the truth recently. Actually, I had to tell you. I went to a chiropractor. It turns out the car accident I was in when I was 16 came back to haunt me because I thought I had bounced back, when you're young.
Oh, sure.
And now that I'm in my late 30s, it's like, oh, no, you didn't quite bounce back from that. It causes debilitating pain. So now we're going to fix you. And I'm like, perfect. But 2 months ago, I'm reading online all these things about like how I could have, all these issues, and it's very stressful, and it can cause like continued issues, like your stomach and your brain are connected. So when you're
Yeah.
stressed out, you start having like stomach issues. It's all interconnected.
Oh, absolutely. As a young child who had terrible anxiety, I still have bad anxiety, but stomach aches were the biggest thing that I dealt with, just on a
Mm-hmm.
daily basis with these terrible stomach aches. But it's all because it was related to anxiety.
What other real world occurrences did you find? I found the War of the Worlds radio broadcast. Did you see that one?
So yeah, so we would obviously be amiss if we did not bring this up. This is the classic story of Orson Welles putting on this radio production of H.G. Wells's no relation, H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. And the way that they set it up was a mock like news report. So they'd have their radio show, and then, oh, we have a emergency report from this reporter, and he talks about how this thing came down. And if you've read War of the Worlds, it's basically a play-by-play of the story. And the funny thing is about this is that it is always brought up as one of these big examples of mass hysteria, when in fact it wasn't. So I went sort of down a rabbit hole with this one, which I thought was funny, because everything got blown so out of proportion, it almost did become mass hysteria, in the sense of, so they had the story, and they said in the beginning, this is a play, this is based on H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. But it just so happened that there was this other radio program on that the majority of America was listening to. And then every now and again, this H.G. Wells one would break in, and they're talking about, they had, I think like the New York Times and all these big papers the next day were talking about how there were huge riots and people were panicking and all this stuff because they thought it was aliens. And then in retrospect, when they're looking at it, it's like, okay, well, the actual percentage of people that were listening to it isn't or wasn't as big as people initially thought. To, like I said, this is 1938, so this is pre-World War II. So they were worried that there was actually a invasion or some sort of war starting already with Germany. They didn't catch the part that it was about aliens, and so people were panicking because of that. But at the end of the day, a lot of the talk of the hysteria was just blown out of proportion from what actually happened.
Well, that's not unusual now in today's world of the
Oh
media
gosh.
taking something, chewing it up, and it becomes something else. I always think about, I saw raw footage one time of celebrities doing, so I don't remember, they were doing something. It looked so nonchalant, nothing. And then the headlines that eventually accompanied whatever the footage was made such a huge deal out of whatever it is. And then, of course, that starts the conversation of what people are talking about. And then the news now reports on people's reactions to things, which further
Right.
increases like the response.
Well, it's interesting because you're using the emotion sort of as the clickbait, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where instead of saying, hey, this is what happened, it's like, well, how did you feel when this happened? And suddenly what actually happened wasn't nearly as important as how people felt about it, which then somehow like changes the course of the narrative.
So what do you think of cancel culture in the context of mass hysteria?
What do you mean?
So in many cases, cancel culture is used to call out a celebrity or a person in general, or a business for unethical or bad, abusive, whatever. The spectrum is pretty wide.
Mm-hmm.
And what tends to happen is the information gets out, and it kind of gets larger and larger and larger and larger. And then like a whole groups of people are intentionally canceling what a person, organization, or whatever, with the means of like destroying their PR, ruining their business, all that stuff. And sometimes the cancel culture is trying to push a perspective that needs exposure, whether it's like, the Me Too movement, where you want to make sure that people understand that women are being treated badly and then hoping for change. But then sometimes it gets propelled quickly. And then later on, with more information, you find out that not all the information was out there in the first place. This actual real story was the case, not what was originally, perceived. That sometimes the information was completely wrong to begin with. That it was someone else created a rumor, like as part of that original definition, created a rumor or created a false photo or a false headline, and it just spiraled from there. So I guess my thoughts are like, is that the modern day mass hysteria, depending on like the context and the outcome?
Possibly from my understanding, what we are going through as a society right now, and I believe the term woke is also associated with this as well, where it's hey, we're realizing that the way that we've been doing things, or the way things have happened in history, are not fair to a group, right? So with the Me Too movement, was really trying to get people to understand, like, hey, look, the way men and women are treated is so much more different than you think it is, right? And when a woman says that I was assaulted, your first reaction is, well, what were you wearing? Or what did you say? Or something like that. And it's like, no, that's not how it works. So as a society, we've figured out this problem. And then what happens is, in our society, I feel like when there's an issue, there needs to be an immediate response. There cannot be any time given, right? We can't say, let's sit down, let's talk about this, let's figure out what's going on. It's, what are we going to do right now, immediately? So you have people like Harvey Weinstein, who it comes out is just an absolute sleazeball, and he gets he's in jail right now, I believe, right? That's a good thing. But then you have other times where people are getting accused and all this stuff, and it's because we need to have an immediate response. And so if this person is, hey, this person mistreated a woman back in 1986, he needs to be canceled right now. That is what you're talking about, where there's a lot of stuff that's happened since 1986, and people change for the better. And so that would be the negative effects of cancel culture. It's sort of the pull the trigger before figuring out who you're shooting at. So if we can get over this idea of having an instant response to something, I think that canceling can be much more meaningful and thoughtful. As far as it being a type of hysteria, I don't know. I think it's still a good thing, because we're trying to understand the best way to treat people and realize that certain groups have not been treated well. And obviously this entire conversation could be its own podcast. But it's almost like people are getting on the train, right? And if you get on the train of canceling people, suddenly you're feeling better about yourself because you're on the side of, being a part of the cancel, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's so interesting.
That was a no. That was a big no.
It's to me, cancel culture is so interesting because there's so many facets to it and so many purposes. And then of course you have people that can take it off the rails or use it for unintended purposes, or things bite back, or many times it moves with the general, I guess, public, what do I want to say? Public perspective, or like what do I call it? The court of public social opinion, right? So like things are constantly ebbing and flowing. And so I have personal experience with this on a more local level, where many times I do press releases, and I have to make sure that when I put information out, it is complete, it is transparent,
Mm-hmm.
and I have to be mindful of how words can influence or misrepresent something. And one of the things that we have to make sure that I'll sometimes notice, depending on how hot of the topic it is the comments will start to explode, and you'll always find people that might not fully know things about the
Mm-hmm.
topic, but they are really, really forward about what they think is happening. And so we have to be really careful to make sure that we address those quickly before it spirals. And I'm trying to think of cases where that's gotten like really, really big.
Well, I mean, I think I spoke about it earlier, but when we look at what happened during COVID, talk about the amount of backlash that the vaccine got.
Mm-hmm.
And we have people telling people to drink bleach or use this horse pill or
Yes.
all this stuff. Now, there was this really huge thing of, it was almost like the mistrust of the government. If the government is telling you to get vaccinated, they're like, I don't believe you. But there was definitely that spread of misinformation, which did create a panic. And I know people personally who, I guess in their case, their parents were like, don't you dare get that vaccine. If you get that vaccine, you're not welcome at home. I
Oh,
mean,
wow.
it was that divisive. And, we can sit here again, whole nother podcast topic and just talk about what happened during COVID. But there was a huge panic that getting that vaccine was going to cause autism. It was going to cause birth defects. Like all these things were going to happen. But it was this spread of either misinformation or information without the right context going on. And that's, I mean, very recent. It's still very raw and still very recent, but it's a prime example of really modern mass hysteria.
And it's hard. I always feel like that it's going to be difficult to prevent that even moving into the future, because it is important to be fully informed on the issues. And many times the headline doesn't provide all the information. And many times the headline is purposely written to be the most salacious, controversial, like you
It's
name
all
it.
about selling the papers, getting the ratings and getting the clicks.
Mm-hmm.
And it's become who's ever loudest is the one that's going to be heard rather than who's the most accurate.
And then you combine that with social media. And this was my note with social media mass hysteria, where the current business model fuels controversy, fear, negativity, divisiveness, and disinformation to boost ad sales and revenue.
Yep.
So combining that with just the environment of today, where you have people that are trying to bring light some very serious issues, what people would call cancel culture, or just what people are trying to influence each other online, the internet just creates a very interesting web for the potential to create mass hysteria.
Right. And I think people have said this too, where, what social media has done is given people an equal footing of talk time with experts. Right. So now you can have a doctor talk about a vaccine, but then this guy over here has the same amount of power to put their opinions out. And it's caused an imbalance by being equal, which is kind of a weird way to think about it.
Yes. Well, and that gets me thinking about this very podcast episode, and the ability to share our opinion observations, but I'm 100% not an expert, right? And I assume neither are you.
No.
And we're talking about this from the perspective of writers that are kind of absorbing the world and, using it for writing, should anybody be interested in writing about mass hysteria.
Exactly.
Okay, so we kind of started going into this. Are there scientific explanations to these real occurrences? I also saw that there's stress and anxiety. You talked about anxiety. Is there anything else?
I think religion's a big one. You talked about nuns biting. I think living under the umbrella of a religion helps to explain a lot of things, and not getting into what's good or bad about religion. We're not talking about that. But if you think of things like an exorcism, right? If someone's acting bizarrely, you have the lens of religion looking at that. And I'll just say Christianity, because that's the one I'm most familiar with. And it's like, oh, well, that's a demon in that person. And that's why they're acting that way. And that's more, we can call that a supernatural type of explanation. But for, the people that live through that sort of life and have those sorts of beliefs, things like religion are going to explain a lot of those weird things. And so, I don't know, have you ever seen the videos online of um, like the dancing churches, and people start speaking in tongues? And
I've seen that in movies. I haven't seen like YouTube videos or real footage.
yeah, I mean, I see it as reels. I guess I don't go out looking for it myself, but these people are dancing and they're speaking gibberish, and that's all one acceptable because it's the Holy Spirit that is through them, but that's the lens which they are seeing it, rather than, I don't know, anything else that could be explaining it. It's like, well, the Lord is through me and I'm speaking gibberish, and that's because that's the Holy Spirit, and I'm dancing because I feel XYZ. Um, so when I look at things like mass hysteria, especially, when we're looking at some from, the 14th, 15th century, where the power was in the church, you know, those are
Mhm.
the way, at least that era was able to explain the behavior.
For writers exploring mass hysteria in their work, I feel like there's they can either go with a scientific explanation or like a supernatural explanation. What are your thoughts on those two types, and are there pros and cons to both?
It depends on what you want to write. If you're trying to write, let's say, a science fiction, you're going to want to go with the scientific. If you're wanting to write a fantasy, you're going to want to probably do something supernatural.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you try to mix those up, that's when you're going to have the issues. When you are writing science fiction, you're trying to say that there's this unexplored uh, idea in space. I don't know what I'm trying to say, but supernatural ghosts, boogeymen, that's going to be a harder sell. But if you're doing a fantasy, that's going to be a lot easier of a sell.
That makes me think of ancient Greece, I think, where they had, I forgot, oracles, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And the oracles were believed to have powers, but if I remember correctly, it's the scientific reason was because they were close to some kind of holes in the ground that
Yeah,
would,
some gases were escaping, and they were basically just super high,
yeah.
just tripping like crazy. And yeah, and people are like, oh my God, this is the smartest thing I've ever heard in my life.
So now we just smoke some weed and you could be your own personal oracle.
That's right, exactly.
Okay, what genres best suit the use of mass hysteria? Can I write a romance about mass hysteria? Is that possible?
Yeah, everything's possible. um this was a interesting question that you had posed, like, uh what's the best way to explore mass hysteria? And I thought about this a lot, and I think the easiest way is you have to show that what's happening to people is not normal. And that's like, well, yeah, no duh. But like the communion book that I talked about earlier, the guy takes a lot of time saying, like, I've had psychological evaluations and I'm not over zealous with religion and this sort of thing. So this doesn't make sense. And when you think of, I'm going to keep going back to this because I think it's hilarious, is the nuns biting people. Like, nuns biting people is not something you go, yeah, that makes sense, right? You're like, that's weird. That's really weird. Or an entire town dancing, or um, the we forgot to mention this, but one of my other favorites is the Satanic Panic, where tons and tons of parents in the 80s were afraid that their daycares were stealing their kids and performing satanic rituals on them. And of
How
course,
did that one start? Was it like just one person saw something or they made it up? How'd that work?
um, that's a good question. I think, that's when I know like Dungeons and Dragons really was getting the
Mm.
ire of people. And
And metal
um,
music, right? Like,
oh God, metal music. I
it's
had
so sad that I'm thinking of Stranger Things now with the
Yep.
one character who kind of represents the metal, and everyone thought he was bad, and that it was based off a real case, right? Where I think a town went after one particular metalhead and thought he was bad. My
Mhm.
memory's not so great. That was earlier this summer, but anyway, keep going. I'm sorry.
um yeah, I think I had just found a old video that I posted on my Instagram that was for parents, and it was, oh hi cat, um basically like how to tell if your child is worshiping Satan. And it's like, are they listening to heavy metal music? Are they rude to you? Do you see sacrificial, implements, a robe, a cup, and all this stuff? And it was just so ridiculous, but it was
Wow.
funny at the
Right.
time. Now that we're looking back, and I'm like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. But at the time, obviously, it was enough to make this, how-to video for parents. So it's all about, if you're going to have something super fantastical like that, like it almost has to have a backdrop of, realism, maybe
Hmm.
even hyper realism. So um, if you have a sect of ancient god worshippers having, this mass hysteria type thing, you're kind of like, okay, that's not really that surprising. But if you really want to go for it, make sure it's real. Make sure it's coming from a place that's believable. And even, I'm a science fiction fantasy writer. I know you do some sci-fi, and one of the rules of sci-fi is like you've got to make it believable,
Hmm.
right? Otherwise, it gets a little too fantastical. And that's when you're, so yeah, if, to your point, if you want to do a romance, like I'd read that. That'd be crazy. That'd be really interesting. But you got to make it like, it's got to make sense
That is
at
right. It's
some
right down my
point.
alley. I love merging weird genres. I know the traditional book industry might not like it, but it's like a fun challenge.
100%.
So the 80s, what is it called? Satan Panic? Satanic Panic?
Satanic Panic.
Okay. That was, in the 80s, which to me, I keep thinking is 20 years ago. It is not.
Me
It is
too.
40 some years ago. Um, Clearly, based off of history and repetition, we humans have a tendency to do this. So if you had to predict what our next mass hysteria would be, what do you think it would be?
Oh man, couldn't even give me this one to think about beforehand.
Well,
Uh,
sorry, I just came up with it. I have one idea. Okay.
yeah, you go. Let's hear
What
it.
me and my colleague and I were talking, and we were talking about how it's gotten so hot. And especially, I'm like feeling okay based off of past patterns of, climate change and, the populations moving around the earth, depending on where the temperatures were. I imagine we're going to invade Canada next. And he was like, no, Canada likes us. Like, I'm very extreme when it comes to speculation. He's like, no, Canada likes us. They're just going to open the doors. I'm like, I don't know. I don't know about that because, we're just going
No,
to like, we're going to go in. And I just think that if we're going to have some mass hysteria, it might be associated with temperature, weather, movements, that kind of stuff.
I mean, the sad thing is everything I can think of is sort of already happening. If we think
Okay.
about like, the government's coming for your guns, or,
Hmm.
um, you
Aliens right
know,
now, alien sightings. That's
aliens.
happening.
Oh God, that's happened since the 40s. We've,
Oh,
oh God, we've soaked that up since, I saw a map the other day that was showing every like UFO sighting in the world, and biggest percentage of those was in America.
oh.
Which is
So
like,
it's
yeah, it makes sense.
technology.
It's
It's like
technology.
yeah.
It's in our culture. I mean, how many alien movies, stories do we have out there? That's that's part of our blood as being an American, is believing in aliens and UFOs.
Okay, so then aside from things that are always already happening, any other thoughts on future hysterias, predictions?
Yeah, I think, predictions.
Mine was just the invasion of Canada, which is pretty aggressive and violent. And
I keep thinking
I
of.
hope we don't do that.
I hope not either. Because I live in Minnesota, so we're kind of right in the front line there. You're in Arizona, you guys would be fine.
Oh, well, no, I'm the one that's going to want to get away the most as the temperature keeps creeping up. I'm just thankful our AC units still work. I'm waiting for I don't know, some kind of, what do you call it? That electronic pulse that just takes out all. And then there's no way we'd be living down in Arizona anymore.
Now, it's actually, now that I think about it, kind of interesting because the more these things rise, so let's just say like temperatures, right? The harder it is for us to live. If the higher our stress gets, maybe we're going to become even more susceptible to ideas that create mass hysteria.
Yes, I agree. All right. Do you have any final remarks, Ian? This has been a great conversation.
No, thank you so much for having me on again. I love these talks.
I love them too. And we always go kind of deep. We kind of get into the psyche and we study society. It's a little scary, but it's good.
It's,
All right.
You know what? It's what you do as being a writer.
Mm-hmm.
It's 100% what you do is you got to look at society and kind of piece it together and tear it apart and figure out how we tick.
How can people find you? Like, not literally, don't go find your house. Go find you online.
Well, I'm in Minnesota. You guys know that much. Yeah. So I have a website, ianyoungwrites.com, where I have a lot of information about my book that's out, The Automaton, and some short stories. You can also find me on Instagram at ianyoungwrites, where I can post funny videos and make people laugh. But mostly it's about writing.
Speculative Sandbox is a volunteer-run podcast that relies on the collaboration of fellow creators like you. Join the conversation and participate in fun polls and questionnaires on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Interested in being in a future episode? Our DMs are open, or you can email speculativesandbox@gmail.com.